My name is Simone Finch, and I'm 34 years old. Christmas dinner at my parents' house had always been loud, but that year it was loud in a way that made my stomach turn cold before anyone even spoke. The table was set the way it always was, white candles burning low. My mother's good china laid out as if she were hosting royalty instead of her own children. I sat across from my sister Deline, already 3 glasses of wine deep, and grinning like she knew a secret the rest of us didn't. My mother stood at the head of the table, tapping her fork against her glass for attention. I remember thinking she looked far too pleased with herself for someone about to make an announcement over turkey and mashed potatoes. "I have some news," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "We finally sold your grandmother's house." She paused, letting the words settle over the table like a held breath. Then she looked straight at me, her smirk sharpening into something almost cruel. "You were never in the will anyway, Simone, so I don't know why you'd care." The room went quiet for a beat, but it wasn't the quiet of shock. It was the quiet of people waiting to see how I'd react, hungry for something to gossip about later. My sister broke the silence first, laughing into her wine glass. "Good," she said. "She'd have just wasted it anyway. Simone's never been good with money." I felt the old familiar sting of being written off by my own family. The same sting I'd felt my whole life, whenever they decided I was the disappointment, the flaky one, the one who didn't deserve a seat at the table when it came to anything that mattered. Grandma Iris had raised me for 3 summers, when my parents were going through a divorce nobody wanted to talk about. She taught me how to can tomatoes in that kitchen, how to grow vines stubborn enough to survive frost, how to stretch a dollar until it screamed. That house wasn't just wood and brick to me. It was the only place I'd ever felt like I mattered. But I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or slam my hand on the table the way the old version of me might have. Instead, I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "Cool," I said finally, setting the glass down with a soft click against the tablecloth. "Hope you enjoy the cash." I let a small smile play at the corner of my mouth before adding, "Since I'm the one who bought it." The table went silent. My mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. My sister's laugh died in her throat, replaced by confusion that slowly curdled into disbelief. My father, who hadn't said a word all evening, set down his napkin and looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in years. What none of them knew was that 6 months earlier, an anonymous LLC I'd quietly formed had placed a bid on Grandma Iris's house the moment it hit the market. A bid routed through a real estate attorney who kept my name out of every document. I'd spent 2 years building a small but stubborn financial consulting business out of a spare bedroom. The same quiet determination Grandma Iris had once taught me over tomato plants and canning jars. Every dollar I saved, every client I took on, every sacrifice I made while my family assumed I was drifting through life had been building toward one goal. I wasn't going to let strangers tear out the counters she'd stood at for 40 years. I wasn't going to let my family sell off the one place that had ever felt like home to me. Not without a fight, even one they didn't know was happening. My mother's face moved through disbelief, embarrassment, and something dangerously close to fear. "That's not possible," she said, her voice thinner than before. "The sale went through a private buyer. There's no way." "There's every way," I said calmly, cutting her off without raising my voice. "I've had the keys for 3 weeks." Deline set her glass down, so hard I thought it might crack. My father cleared his throat, but no words came. For the first time in longer than I could remember, no one at that table had anything clever left to say. Looking around at their stunned faces, I understood this was only the beginning of everything they were about to learn about the daughter they'd underestimated for far too long. The days after Christmas were unusually quiet in a way that felt heavier than any argument. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from relatives who'd heard some twisted version of what happened, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. My mother texted me twice, then deleted both messages before I could respond, which told me everything about how rattled she really was. Deline wasn't so quiet. She showed up at my apartment 3 days later, still in the same designer coat she'd worn to dinner, arms crossed tight against the cold and against me. "You humiliated Mom," she said the moment I opened the door, skipping any greeting. Do you have any idea what people are saying? I stepped aside and let her in anyway, because despite everything, she was still my sister, and some habits don't vanish just because trust does. I didn't say anything that wasn't true. I told her, keeping my voice level. I bought the house. That's not humiliation, Deline. That's just a fact you didn't want to hear. She paced my living room, heels clicking against the hardwood. For a moment, something flickered across her face that looked almost like fear instead of anger. Why would you even want that house? She asked, finally sitting down across from me. It's falling apart. The plumbing's ancient. Mom said the buyer would probably tear it down and build something new. That's exactly why I bought it, I said quietly, because none of you understood what that house actually meant to any of us. I thought of Grandma Iris standing at that same stove, teaching me to fold dough with flour-dusted hands, telling me stories about surviving hard winters long before any of us were born. Deline had been too young to remember most of it, and my parents had spent so many years resenting Grandma Iris's influence over me that they never once asked why it mattered so much. 2 weeks later, my mother finally called instead of texting, her voice clipped and formal, like she was speaking to a stranger. She wanted to know my terms, whether I intended to sell the house back to the family, whether this had all been some elaborate scheme to prove a point. I told her the truth. I hadn't bought the house to punish anyone. I bought it because it was the only piece of our family's history worth preserving, and because for years I'd watched relatives treat Grandma Iris's legacy like an inconvenience to be liquidated rather than something worth protecting. What surprised me most wasn't my mother's reaction, or even Deline's. It was my father, who showed up at the house unannounced on a gray Saturday afternoon while I was repainting the front porch railing, the same railing Grandma Iris used to sit on during summer evenings, with a glass of sweet tea in her hand. He stood at the edge of the yard for a long moment before speaking. I should have fought harder for you to be included, he said, his voice rougher than I had ever heard it. Your grandmother would be proud of what you did here. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest thing to one I'd gotten from him in years. For the first time since Christmas dinner, something in my chest loosened, just slightly. Word spread through the rest of the family faster than I expected, and slowly the story shifted. Instead of being the daughter who'd caused a scene at Christmas, I became the granddaughter who'd quietly, patiently fought to save something everyone else had been ready to throw away. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years reached out. Aunts who used to whisper about my flaky career choices suddenly wanted to know how I'd built a business successful enough to buy a house outright. I didn't need their approval anymore, but I won't pretend it didn't feel good to finally be seen for who I actually was, instead of who they decided I would always be. I spent that spring restoring the house room by room, keeping what mattered: the creaky third stair, the hand-painted tiles in the kitchen, the rose bushes Grandma Iris planted the year I was born. I didn't do it to prove anything to my mother or my sister. I did it because some things are worth fighting for quietly, even when the people around you assume you're not capable of the fight at all. By summer, the house smelled like her again, cinnamon and old wood, and something warm I couldn't quite name, but recognized the instant I walked through the door.